So let's get started on today's topic. At the end of the lecture, or the last part of the lecture, we're going to look at the basic argument against free will. In the first parts of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the nature of free will and what intuitive ideas about what acting freely and of your own free will are. Now, before we get started, I have an exercise for you all. Like I said earlier, I think most people have thought at some point or another about whether they have free will. Perhaps they've made some decision or choice and acted in a particular way, and they thought, well, maybe that wasn't free. Maybe I was coerced into it. Maybe I just did it because of peer pressure. Maybe I just did it because of my character or my upbringing. Maybe I was manipulated. Maybe I was determined in some other way. So all these kind of thoughts that people have are thoughts about the nature of free will and about the reality of free will, whether they actually have free will. So what I want you to do as a beginning exercise on your own, and keep this all to yourself. You don't need to share it with anyone. You don't need to share it with me. You don't need to share it with any of your peers. I want you to start by thinking, do you have free will? Many people seem to think, yes, they do have free will, but there are people who think, no, I don't. And whether you think you have free will or not, I want you to write down your reasons. Why don't you think you have free will? Or why do you have free will? I want you to write down your answers and keep them safe. Put them in your drawer and keep them safe. And then at the end of the lecture sections, I want you to go back to them and see whether you still agree. Maybe you've changed your mind and now you think you don't have free will. Or maybe you've changed your mind about what free will consists in. Or maybe you've decided now that, you do have free will. Whatever happens, I want you to use this as a reflective exercise to see how thinking more deeply about these issues can change how we think about them. So let's start by thinking about what is free will. So one very common idea is that acting freely means that your actions are undetermined. Now, what would it mean for your actions to be determined? Now, suppose you do something in the present. Suppose you attended this lecture. And suppose you found out that you attended this lecture because, you decided to attend the day before. And the reason you decided to attend the day before was because it's like you decided to come to university and so on. Then you think, well, why did you decide to come to university? Maybe because your parents told you that going to university was a good thing. Now, why did they think that? Well, they thought that because their parents told them. And what if there was just a chain of causes going all the way back to the beginning of time? So at the start of time, things were set up such that what you did was inevitable, necessary. It was always going to happen. And one way of thinking about this is that your decision to come to this lecture today was determined by things that happened all the way in the past, long before you were born. Now, for many people, the idea that actions are determined in that way means that they cannot be free. There's something about actions being determined that just seems incompatible with free will. Free will just seems to mean that they're undetermined. Now, another idea associated with free will is that you have an open future. So the idea with an open future is that things in the future aren't set or determined, it's open. So whether or not you come to the lecture tomorrow, that's an open question. It could well be that you decide, no, I'm going to stay at home and just watch Netflix. Or you decide you're going to go for a walk in the park. What happens, you might think, hasn't been set, hasn't been determined, because you have free will, and other people have free will as well. So what they do and what you do is going to be the determining factor, among the determining factors of what happens in the future. But right now, those things haven't happened. Their free actions haven't occurred. So the future is open. Now, another very common idea is that we have alternative possibilities. And this idea is most well explained by thinking about forking paths. So suppose you're walking in a park and you get to a fork in the road. You can either go left or right. Now, when you have that kind of moment in your life, you might think, I could easily go left. I could easily go right. There's nothing about this that means I have to go right or have to go left. It's open to me. I have genuine alternative possibilities. Now, this seems very much associated with the idea of acting freely and of your own free will. When you think back to your actions or decisions or choices that you consider to be ones that were exercises of free will, you might think, I could have made a different choice. I could have made a different decision, but you decided what you did and you went down that particular path. Another idea, very much in line with the other ideas, is that what we do is up to us. Our decisions or choices originate within us. So when you make a particular decision, you decide to take the left on the left fork on the road, that's up to you. It was you that decided. So it wasn't that just that you got to a fork in the road and then somebody pushed you one way or the other. It's rather that you yourself, as a human being, as a person, as an agent, you decided, you went through a decision-making process, you thought, yes, left is better than right. Or you thought, no, right is better than left. Regardless of which choice you made, it was your choice. It was up to you. It's up to you to choose to go left, or it was up to you to choose to go right. Now, I want us to look now at some definitions of free will from philosophers. So the philosophers Michael McKenna and Dirk Perboom define free will like this. They say that free will is the unique ability of persons to exercise the strongest sense of control over their actions necessary for moral responsibility. On the other hand, the philosopher Robert Caine says that free will is the power of agents to be the ultimate creators or originators and sustainers of their own ends or purposes. And Carl Genet, he says, by freedom of the will is meant freedom of action. I have freedom of action at a time if more than one alternative is open to me. Now let's start by thinking, well, what do these definitions have in common? Is there any kind of they're all quite different. They're different in their phrasing, but is there any sort of commonalities, any similarities that we can spot in these definitions? Well, one thing that you might notice is that none of them mention determinism. So one of the earlier ideas that I mentioned is that free will just means that your actions are undetermined. To act freely and of your own free will means that what you do isn't determined by the past or anything else. It's up to you. So why is it that these philosophers' definitions of free will, why is it that they don't mention determinism? So you might think that some people are going to say, well, free will just means that an action is undetermined. But why do these philosophers not say that? Let's think about that. One reason is, well, it's not that many philosophers think that free will is compatible with determinism. Many of them don't. Robert Caine, Dirk Perboom, and Carl Genet are all incompatibilists. They all think that free will is not compatible with determinism. But they don't favor a definition of free will that builds their own view of what free will is into it. So if you were to say free will means an action is undetermined, you're kind of just saying incompatibilism is true, and you're saying it's true without providing any kind of argument. So instead of trying to settle a debate before it's begun, these philosophers have gone with more neutral definitions. They try to define free will in a way that, at least on the face of it, they could still be compatible with determinism. It might just happen then that free will isn't compatible with determinism, but they don't want to prejudge the issue. They want everyone to have the argument. And if they were to define free will as an action being undetermined, they'd kind of be saying, well, compatibilists are obviously wrong, so why are we even having this conversation? Now, let's look at some other features of these definitions. So in the McKenna and Perboom definition, they highlight that free will is an ability of persons to exercise the strongest sense of control over their actions necessary for moral responsibility. So their definition of free will depends on what moral responsibility is. Well, what's moral responsibility? And that's something that you'll notice in many of these debates, that moral responsibility is going to be very much the main interest of many philosophers in why they're interested in free will. Now, Robert Caine, on the other hand, he doesn't mention moral responsibility at all. Rather, he thinks about an ability or power of agents. And it's a particular ability or power, namely to be the ultimate creators or originators of their own ends and purposes. So he sees something more agential there about what they do. Now, Carl Genet, on the other hand, he doesn't mention moral responsibility. He doesn't mention being the ultimate creator or originator of your own actions or ends or purposes. Rather, he defines free will first in terms of freedom of action, and then freedom of action in terms of having alternative possibilities. So he says, I have freedom of action at a time if more than one alternative is then open to me. So having free will just means having free action, and being able to act freely is just a matter of having more than one alternative open to you. So I want to call the first definition here the moral responsibility definition. The reason to pick this out, as we'll see, is that many philosophers, indeed much of the contemporary free will debate, has really become a debate about moral responsibility. Acting freely, or what free will is really pegged to what moral responsibility is. On the other hand, Kane and Genet gave what I'm going to call the agency definition. For them, moral responsibility might still be an important issue, but it's not going to be the only issue. And rather, free will itself is not really important just because of its connection to free will, and nor should we change what we think free will is depending on what the nature of moral responsibility turns out to be. Rather, free will is just going to be a sort of feature of our agency, of our personhood, that is independent of whatever the conditions on being morally responsible are. But among the agency definitions, there are two different ones that come up. We have Kane's, which is more of a what we're going to call a sourcehood or ultimate sourcehood definition. So here, free will is more about being the source of your actions. It's more about you have free will when actions come from you, like they have some sort of original or origin inside you. You're the cause yourself of them and not something outside of you. On the other hand, Genet favors like leeway definition. So thinking of leeway means things going two ways, or things being open to going a different way. And Genet is very much, well, it's not so much important that you're the source of your actions. It's more important that things could have been otherwise. The fact that you made a choice to do one thing didn't rule out you being able to make a choice to do another. So some initial questions we might have here. I'm not going to answer them immediately, but I want us to bear them in mind. So we might wonder, well, what is moral responsibility? McKenna and Pereboom are defining free will in terms of moral responsibility, but now we need to know what moral responsibility is. And as we'll see, that's quite a big and controversial question. So many people have meant many different things by moral responsibility. So we might worry that this definition isn't really helping us very much, because now we need to go off and find out what moral responsibility is. And so we might wonder also, what's involved in being an ultimate creator, right? Or originator? What does that mean? Like, what does it mean to say that things don't have any source outside of me? That seems a little bit weird because, you know, we're human beings, agents within a world. We act within a world for things happening all around us. Or is it the case that we're not influenced by what happens all around us? That would be odd. Right. And when it comes to alternative possibilities, we might wonder, well, does it mean, does having any kind of alternative open to me mean that I have free will? Maybe, for example, you had a choice between, you know, being mean to your friend or being a little bit more mean, right? Both are bad. And you could have sort of made a really vicious remark or just a vicious remark. If those were the only two choices ahead of you, you would have alternatives over what you did. But would it really be the case that you had free will then? Who knows? These are among the questions that we're going to ask. So now I want to briefly mention a distinction that often comes up in literature about free will. So you probably noticed that I've moved between talking about free will and acting freely. And indeed, in Carl Genet's definition, he says that free will just is freedom of action. It just is acting freely. But I want you to be cautious here, very, very cautious, because for some people, they mean different things. So for Genet, they mean the same thing. And many people write that way. They'll just talk about acting freely or freedom of action as just being exercising free will or acting of your own free will. For Robert Kain and others, they think they're different. So for the Kain, you can act freely, but not of your own free will. And so these two things come apart. So you might say a person, well, look, they made their own choice, they made their own decision, and they were acting freely. Yeah, and by that, they just mean that they were not constrained by the circumstances. They're nothing. A person wanted an ice cream, and they got an ice cream. They acted freely. But for Kain, it matters why you wanted to have an ice cream. Why did you have the motivation or desire or need for an ice cream? Right? So even if you do whatever you want, maybe that you don't really have a choice over what you want. If for Kain and some others, freedom of the will or free will is really about the sort of power to control your own character, your own psychology, your own mental states, your own psychological states, your desires, and such things. If you lack complete control over that, those kinds of things, then even though you can act freely and get what you want, you're not really having freedom of the will in Robert Kain's sense. Because for him, it's really a kind of control that you have over yourself, over the kind of person you are. And then once you have this kind of control over who you are, you then, as a result, have this control over your actions. So you really want some ice cream and you act freely because nothing stops you getting that ice cream. If you influence the fact that you had that desire for ice cream, then when you got the ice cream, you're unhindered in getting the ice cream. That action would not only be a free action, but also one that was of your own free will. So be careful here. It's just something to bear in mind when you're reading through the philosophical literature, is that philosophers are often very idiosyncratic in their definitions. And you have to be very careful not to get it the wrong way. Because if you're reading Kain and you think that he thinks that there's no difference between acting freely and freedom of the will, then you're going to misunderstand some of the points he makes. Likewise, if you're reading Genet and you think he thinks there's a difference between acting freely and exercising free will, you're not going to understand what's going on. So just be careful here. This is an annoying feature of philosophers, that we don't always use terms in exactly the same way, which creates further hurdles to understanding what's happening. But once we bear in mind what people mean, and we can see what's happening and not have any problems.